Hello, my name's Mark and I like talking about KBAs. KBAs are key biodiversity areas. They are the most important places in the world for species and their habitats. Given the current global environmental crisis, we need to focus our collective efforts on conserving those places that matter most. And this programme supports the identification, the mapping, monitoring and conservation of KBAs to help safeguard these most critical sites for nature on our planet. Locally, in the region, we've identified to date 577 key biodiversity areas across Oceania. So that's Papua New Guinea and Palau across the French Polynesia. 125 of these KBAs include at least one species of bat as a trigger species. Briefly, just to go through, the first idea of KBAs was the identification of important bird areas between 2003 and 2010. That was a combination of field work and a number of desk-based studies. Alliance for Zero Extinction Sites have also been collected since 2005, and some bat species are being identified as trigger species for AZE sites in the region. Polynesia and Micronesia, the CEPF programme identified KBAs in 2005 independently of the IBA programme, so there are double and overlapping of layers there. 2006 to 2010, KBAs were identified by CSIRO and CI in Papua New Guinea. That data didn't become freely available till about 2019. And then in 2012, the CEPF also developed the East Melanesian Islands ecosystem profile, used KBAs, identified KBAs through that, and those KBAs were based on a starting point of the IBAs that were come through a few years earlier. All that was undertaken prior to the new KBA standard that was conceived in 2016. More of that later. In terms of where these sites are, you can see the vast majority of the sites are in Papua New Guinea, about 130, 135, but with a range of sites right the way through every single country territory in the region, with the exception of Tuvalu, has currently got an IBA. And if there's any skink specialists in the audience, then I'm sure we can come up with one for Tuvalu. 7 of those countries have actually used bats as one of a number of trigger species within the KBAs in their sites: Samoa, Palau, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Fiji, Micronesia and Papua New Guinea. Oh, and also one in New Caledonia. But there is a bit of a gap. Northern Marianas doesn't have any. There's none on American Samoa. The American states didn't go through the KBA program in 2012 as part of the Polynesia Micronesia KBA assessment in 2005. So a bit more work to be done there. But that's just over 20% of all the KBAs have got bats as trigger species on those sites. So what changed with respect to KBAs in 2016? We came up with a global standard that sort of standardized how you identify KBAs through a whole series of criteria. Now these criteria became rather more robust and quantitative than they were pre-2016, and I'll give you 2 examples. Pre-2016, A1A for most threatened species. If your site had a critically endangered or an endangered species, that was pretty much good enough. Now you have to have about at least 0.5% of the global population and at least 5 reproductive units on a site for it to still qualify. Secondly, a whole range of sites use geographically restricted range species. We now have a more quantitative assessment of that. Firstly, you have this fantastic figure of 18,413 square kilometres for mammals, based on the bottom 25 percentile. So 25% of mammals have a range of or less than 18,413 square kilometres, and so they are qualified as restricted range. So within that, you need to have the species has to have at least 1% of its global population. And for mammal species, you have to have at least 2 of those restricted range species, of each of which has got more than 1% of its global population in that site. Those are just 2 of the criteria. There's 19 in total, and they're the ones that possibly got most used when we put together the original information. If you look at the red list category for those species, around about 2/3 were globally threatened. That's critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable. So yeah, the majority of species were of the globally threatened group. That's category A1 and A2 of A1b earlier. But there were also about 1/3 were either near threatened or least concerned species, with some of it even were in the data deficient category. So you know, the range of species is predominantly the globally threatened ones. If you look at the frequency of occurrence of these species in KBAs, the top two species with 28 KBAs that Dobsonia inermis is recorded in, that's a least concerned species, occurs on 28 sites. It's also not classed as a restricted range species, so it has a range bigger than that 18,000 square kilometres per before. Similarly, Pteropus admiralitatum will be also is the next most commonly occurring species, and it does not occur. Is not a restricted range species. So we do have a bit of an issue. I'm not quite sure how we're going to capture those as trigger species going forward. And it would be worth, next step will be to look at those sites and to see what other species are trigger species on those sites. So whilst they might not continue to be classed as trigger species, they will remain on sites which are classed as KBAs. So hopefully any protection afforded by that KBA will still be available to them as species. After that, you can see most of the species are restricted range species. Many, even in the top, where there's 5 or more, are globally threatened species. And we have a whole series of species, obviously between 4 and 1 sites. Many of those are, some of those at the bottom are Alliance for Zero extinction sites, and almost all of those, clearly almost by definition, are restricted range species as well. So as we get smaller number of sites for an individual species, so it becomes more critical and it becomes more likely that it will continue to be a trigger species for a KBA. Application of KBAs, just a couple of slides. Yeah, clearly the IT target indicated that they were looking for 17% of terrestrial to be protected, and that protected area should be in areas of particular importance of biodiversity. KBAs are a classic representation of what is an area of particular importance of biodiversity. So those areas we would like to see in some form of protection. Currently, within even just those countries which have got bats as KBA trigger species, there are over 2/3, over 70% of the KBAs have no protected area even within their boundary. And a further 22% have part of their KBA has got a protected area within it. And only 6% of KBAs are entirely protected areas. And those are the very much at the smaller end of the KBA scale. So there's a lot of work to do. Didn't achieve the IT target on that one by any means. But obviously we're moving towards 2030 and the 30 by 30 kind of target, and KBAs, key biodiversity areas, are being promoted as being specifically named within that new target. So let's hope that protected areas and then these other effective area-based conservation measures become more important and more targeted at key biodiversity areas. The other thing to flag up is that one of the very first things that the KBA partnership developed was guidelines for business. And this identified 15 guidelines to encourage the use of mitigation hierarchy, which basically minimises the impact of any development within a KBA, starting from don't put it there through to if you've put it there, what can you do to improve the biodiversity elsewhere in the area? And then also working at ways of how can companies support KBAs within this process. KBAs are named in the Forest Finance, forgot the terminology, PS6 and ESF framework as internationally recognised areas of high biodiversity value. I'll do that properly. KBAs are named in the International Finance Corporation PS6 and also in the Environment and Social Frameworks for World Bank as internationally recognised areas of high biodiversity area, so trigger this mitigation hierarchy. So they're being, at global, international financial institutions and international development organisations, this is becoming part of the terminology, part of the language that they are taken into consideration when they're looking at developing into new areas and new sites. Global Environment Facility 7 guidelines state any new protected areas that are established with GEF support must be globally significant as defined by the Key Biodiversity Area Standard. So they're really targeting future protected area work at KBAs. So they want to make sure that those protected areas are going into the right places from a biodiversity perspective. Okay, so in summary, in conclusion, bats form an integral part of the identification of KBAs in many sites around the region. KBAs provide an opportunity to promote site-based conservation focused on the most important sites in the region. Updating the bat trigger species and incorporating their requirements into the conservation measures is essential. Many thanks for listening.